September 2020, a sad time for rugby fans in both Australia and New Zealand. Feeling disregarded by its fellow SANZAAR members, South Africa vote to leave Super Rugby, a competition they had played in for nearly 25 years.
Can they crack it? Honourable. Atherton must score. James Small, they get it finally.
They would join and thrive in their new home of the URC, playing in a challenging club competition alongside the European countries, benefiting massively with upticks in fan interest while removing the long flight times and time zone shifts of Super Rugby. However, their former club competition would not see the same positives. With Australia at rock bottom, Super Rugby would become very predictable. A low skill level and even lower crowd numbers would financially cripple one team, and was looking to do the same to others. So with such poor competition, New Zealand rugby would also suffer, seeing some of their worst results in decades, as well as a decrease in spectators across the board. It was clear Super Rugby was a shadow of its former self. So this all brings us to the current Super Rugby season, and with Australia and New Zealand doing worse than I've ever seen in my lifetime, something needed to change. And change it did. Suddenly, we've seen a major jump in competitiveness. On average, far closer scores and more lead changes throughout the games, something the competition had lacked massively in previous years. This has all resulted in bigger crowds and just better viewer numbers across the board, especially in Australia, once again rivaling the URC, which had overtaken Super Rugby in many of these areas. But to fully understand how the Super Rugby had fallen so far behind the other club league competitions in the first place, we have to go back in time a bit, before South Africa's exit. Ever since the first season, back in 1996, it was fair to say Super Rugby had been a great success. Weekly matches with the close competition of New Zealand, South Africa and Australia would bring in big crowds and strong viewership across each nation. Overall, in terms of skill level, the fast-flowing play style of Super Rugby was widely regarded as the premier club competition, when put next to the European leagues as well. This would also extend to the international sides, with the Southern Hemisphere countries taking almost every World Cup to date, England in 2003 being the singular outlier. In terms of the winners though, the Crusaders and Blues were definitely the more dominant of the teams in the Super Rugby. Australian sides like the Brumbies and Reds were also big contenders each year. Even the Waratahs would clutch a last-minute penalty to win the 2014 edition. But as the years went on, Australian rugby would suffer. With problems starting at schoolboy rugby, this would extend to the professional teams, with loss after loss, including an embarrassing 40-game losing streak to New Zealand sides. With this impacting Australian audiences massively, it was clear changes needed to be made. So in 2017, this would result in the Western Force being axed from Super Rugby.
I think the decision the Australian Rugby Union has to make in terms of 5 to 4 teams, it's difficult to argue against that. What we've got to make sure is that the right decision is made for the right reasons.
Things were only getting worse for Australia as well, with a poor World Cup in 2019 being knocked out in the quarters by a strong England side. Speaking of the 2019 World Cup though, this brings us to South Africa. While they were clearly a dominant side internationally, the same could not be said for their Super Rugby teams. While the Lions had come close with a hat-trick of runners-up medals in 2016, 17 and 18, no South African side had taken home silverware apart from the Bulls with their impressive late 2000s run.
Gets past one, gets to another. This could be it. This is it.
So the question has to be asked, why was South Africa dominating the international competition, but when it came to the Super Rugby, they kept coming up short? Well, the odds were undeniably stacked against them. Tough schedules and different time zones meant for many players battling jet lag and Ben Tamuafina in the same week. And even though South Africans are known for being physical, these players would all be facing less training time amongst other conditions which New Zealand and Australian teams were just not having to deal with so often. It wasn't just the players who were getting the short end of the stick either. A big issue that was impacting fans was the time zones being so separate. Viewers were simply not translating between games in South Africa and Oceania. For a serious fan in South Africa, the majority of their games would be played in the early hours of the morning, making it difficult for viewers to stay engaged on a week-to-week basis when around half of their 16 games a season are played at 3 AM. Even the format was hard to track, with a confusing conference system, meaning some teams wouldn't even play each other in these 16 games. Clearly broadcasters were seeing the same issue, so as the 2017 tournament ended, just like in Australia with the Western Force, a decision was forced onto South African rugby to cut down its number of teams.
So in the process of doing that, you guys, the media, the spectators, the viewers, the fans, and any of the other stakeholders involved in that started speaking to us very clearly. We had no choice but to relook at the competition earlier than what we wanted to.
The Bloemfontein Cheetahs and the Southern Kings, as well as the Western Force, all would be cut from the competition. However, while this was a big loss for Australia, in a statement from Cheetahs CEO Harold Vaster, he made it clear he was actually very positive on the direction the South African sides were going, even describing the split as amicable. The two teams would be joining the United Rugby Championship, or then known as the Pro 12 competition, is the Northern Hemisphere equivalent to Super Rugby, combining teams from Ireland, Wales, Scotland and Italy. And although South Africa is geographically located in the Southern Hemisphere, they share a lot more in common with the countries in the EU and UK. Less travel times for players, plus much better game times for fans who are basically on the same time zone as much of Europe. So you can see why the Kings and Cheetahs were more than happy to leave the much tougher conditions of Super Rugby, and why other South African rugby teams might be looking to do the same. It's not like the South African sides would be losing much competition either. Yes, they wouldn't get to face New Zealand teams on a week-to-week basis. However, considering Ireland with their 4 teams in the competition had just beaten the All Blacks twice in the past 2 years, maybe the competitiveness wasn't so hard to replace after all. So with these South African teams already having decent grounds to withdraw, what could possibly give them a valid reason to pull away from the competition altogether? Well, the answer came in 2020. The year's Super Rugby season would be cancelled, and although New Zealand and Australia would host their own domestic competitions, it was clear when restrictions would be lifted, compromises would have to be made. So with the 2021 season on the horizon, and the pandemic still affecting international travel, rumours began circulating that Australia and New Zealand would be playing in a trans-Tasman competition, or at least their own domestic competitions once again. Upon hearing these rumours, on September 30th, an announcement came from South African Rugby Union Chief Executive Yuri Roo. All 4 remaining South African sides, being Sharks, Stormers, Bulls and Lions, would be exiting the Super Rugby and now playing in the European Pro 14.
New Zealand has got every right to determine their future, but in terms of SANZAR and the joint venture agreement, from the stuff that Andy sends me, we are being deemed as kicked out of Super Rugby.
While the last phrase of the statement seemed to call out New Zealand directly for leaving South Africa out of any plans for the 2021 season, realistically it was going to be pretty tough to make something work. The following day, the reaction from the All Blacks camp didn't seem too surprised with the decision.
There's been whispers and we'd heard that it's probably going to be on the cards potentially for the last couple of years. So we sort of wondered if it was only a matter of time.
Captain Sam Cane saw both positives and negatives as far as South Africa's exit. However, I think his main concern was of how much the future of New Zealand rugby might suffer without the exposure young players get in their first few tours to South Africa.
For me, I don't think there's much bigger challenge than playing a South African team in front of a packed out South African crowd.
The positives he took though echoed what a lot of Springbok players found difficult with the tough schedules and time zones. However, with the Trans-Tasman competition now confirmed for 2021, the attention would turn to a country that had mostly been left out of all these discussions. No, not Argentina, they had been fully left out. I'm talking about Australia. Alongside New Zealand, Australia would play in their own regional competition, even bringing back the Western Force. Sadly, however, attendance numbers and just an overall skill level were lacking. With COVID restrictions having an impact, most games were barely even cracking the 1,000 mark. But comparing this to the NRL, going on at the same time and facing the same crowd restrictions, most games were at least getting crowds to the 5,000 mark. On the other side of the Tasman, however, things were going a lot better. Crowd numbers were consistently in the tens of thousands in the New Zealand edition, and it was clear Australian Rugby Union needed support from their fellow Anzacs now more than ever. With the Trans-Tasman competition on its way now, many Kiwis worried on just how competitive the Aussie teams could be. Recognising this, Chairman Hamish McClanagan would come onto the New Zealand show, The Breakdown, calling for some sympathy from rugby fans to be shown Australia's way, till they got back on their feet.
You've got to respect our position. We know we haven't been as good as we should have been. And there are some systemic issues that we're dealing with within Australian rugby, right from grassroots rugby right through to our high performance area.
The Kiwi opposition, however, would definitely not show any sympathy. Throughout the 5 weeks, only the Reds and Brumbies would register their one respective victory, with the Force, Rebels and Waratahs all going winless. But as the Blues took home the Trans-Tasman Championship, it just didn't feel very significant. I think this was mainly due to it only being a 5-week tournament, but also with only 2 countries participating and heavy crowd restrictions, it just didn't feel like Super Rugby. So while the Trans-Tasman competition had definitely left a lot to be desired, with poor competition and low interest, when looking at how the South African teams had integrated into their new competition, compared to the teams past in Super Rugby, they had found far better success. As the first season of the URC came to its semi-finals, the Bulls and Stormers would beat out Irish competition Ulster and Leinster in respective 1 and 2 point thrillers to make it an all South African URC final. With even the final going down as a nail-biter, it was clear which league had been more competitive. However, whether this translated to better crowds was hard to determine. On paper, attendance numbers were mostly even between both competitions, but with pandemic restrictions, true numbers were hard to gauge. But when looking at TV ratings, the difference was truly night and day. With the new South African additions to the competition, the URC had seen a 170% increase in viewership compared to its Pro 14 predecessor. Meanwhile, for the Super Rugby, audiences were heading in the complete opposite direction. For primetime 7 PM matches in New Zealand, TV ratings were in the 100,000 mark. Comparing this to the pre-2020 times, where these games would often be doubling these numbers, and while Crusaders CEO was putting it on a lower attention span.
So people are watching more snack size version of the product.
Looking at YouTube views for the season, the numbers across the board were at an all-time low. It wasn't just viewership which was seeing a decrease either. Missing the competitiveness of a South African or even an Argentinian side in a weekly club tournament, the All Blacks and Wallabies were seeing the true effects of this with their worst years in decades. In 2020, the All Blacks would lose for the first time ever to Argentina. 2021 would then see 3 losses. A rare result, but they were still close games. However, the 2022 international season would be the All Blacks' worst year since 1998. They would suffer 4 defeats, including a 2-1 home series loss to Ireland, and even their second loss to the Pumas, causing them to drop to their lowest ever position at 5 on the World Rugby rankings. Many called for the sacking of head coach Ian Foster, but while he would keep his job, Wallabies coach Dave Rennie wasn't so lucky. The 2022 international season would see the Wallabies struggle massively, losing 9 of their 14 tests. And with the World Cup just 9 months away, Eddie Jones would replace Dave Rennie to hopefully bring some success to the side. So with so much failure internationally between these teams, a change to the domestic circuit would hopefully bring around some much needed improvement in the Oceanic region. Super Rugby Pacific would add 2 brand new teams, the Fijian Drua and Moana Pacifica. While the Drua is a team run by the Fijian Rugby Union, with home games being played at Churchill Park in Fiji, Moana, on the other hand, are a hybrid team, combining mostly Tongan and Samoan players, having their home games in Auckland. As the teams were announced, a major talking point was the eligibility. For much of these island nations wanted to actually make money at the club level. Travelling overseas, often to New Zealand and Australia, was the only option. These new club teams would hopefully be a net gain across the board for Super Rugby, strengthening the competition as a whole. And as the 2023 season kicked off, in the Drua's first ever home game, they would win an extra time thriller over reigning champions the Crusaders, bringing an atmosphere that we had never really seen before in Super Rugby.
Flags are up in Lautoka. The Fijian Drua are up in Lautoka.
The Drua success would also extend to the Fijian international team, making history by beating England just a few months before the World Cup began. And with Fiji sharing a pool alongside the Wallabies and Wales, the Pacific nation was looking extremely threatening. Even on the world rankings, Fiji was 7th, meanwhile Australia and Wales were 9th and 10th respectively. To make matters worse for the Aussies, Eddie Jones would pick an extremely inexperienced squad, and as Pool C played out, Australian fears would come true. The Wallabies would not even make it to the quarterfinals, getting beaten by Fiji and smashed by Wales, eliminated in pool play for the first time in their history. The All Blacks would also struggle. For the first time in their history, they would lose a game in the pool play, being beaten by the French. This would now see them having to face tournament favourites Ireland in the quarterfinals. And again, for the first time ever in their Rugby World Cup history, they would not be favourites to win the match, with Ireland paying 20 cents more. However, an extra time turnover would see them beat the odds.
New Zealand won the steal. Whitelock! Sam Whitelock!
The All Blacks would eventually make it to the final, falling just short to the Springboks to cap off a pretty successful World Cup campaign, considering they weren't even really favourites coming into the tournament. So with such varied results between Australia and New Zealand in the World Cup, and even on the world rankings now, it was clear just how far apart the countries were in terms of competitiveness. This was evident in one team most of all. Out of the 23-man squad selected for the World Cup final, over a third came from one team, the Crusaders, and there was good reason for this. The Canterbury side was coming off their 7th title win in 7 years, and while this is extremely impressive, for general fans of the game, the endless dominance was just getting a bit boring. In the Scott Robinson era, from 2017 to 2023, the Crusaders' win record was an incredible 87%, making them arguably the most successful professional team in any major sport ever. However, as the 2024 season rolled around, something changed. Whether it was Scott Robinson moving to the All Blacks coaching role, or key players retiring and suffering injuries. Either way, as the season kicked off, the Crusaders would first be defeated by a strong Chiefs side, before being upset by the Waratahs and Drua, eventually starting their season with an 0-5 record. To truly put this in perspective, the Crusaders had not even lost 5 games in an entire season since 2015. This truly was the story of the 2024 season, as the defeats continued, bringing suspense which the competition had lacked for so many years now. In the end, the Crusaders would finish with a 10-4 record, falling to Australian sides who they had picked apart for so many years now. Although this did bring more interest in the Australian side of the competition, it sadly wasn't enough to save the Melbourne Rebels. The club had been struggling for years, losing players and fans to the NRL and AFL. Even when the side was introduced in 2011, the club was running at a loss. The state of Victoria just wasn't on board with the union code, so after an estimated $20 million AUD in debt, and not many signs of any positive changes for the state, this would be the final straw, as they would be given the boot. While this was a more sour end to the season, many of the players were absorbed into other teams, allowing the 4 remaining Aussie teams to be stronger for the future seasons. Speaking of the future overall, things were looking positive in the terms of crowd numbers, TV viewer ratings, and highlight views. The 2024 season was an uptick, which now brings us to the 2025 Super Rugby season, which has just ended, with the Crusaders winning again. But while the season maybe ended on a more sour note, with the same teams we always see in the finals and a few blowouts in the last couple rounds, this definitely doesn't reflect the entirety of the season. Every Australian side has been better, not just against one New Zealand side either this year. On average, the Aussie teams have been just far more competitive across the 16 rounds. Even Moana Pacifica, with the help of Ardie Savea, have secured their best placement ever. This has led to the attendance going up in the league as a whole, at a 6% increase in crowd numbers. I know this doesn't sound massive, but with the Rebels now gone, which means that there's less games to be played, this is actually a bigger increase than it looks like. With the Aussie teams finding more success against New Zealand teams, the biggest improvement has been in TV viewership. Across the board, Australian viewership is up 27%, even with one less team. Another huge growth area has been in YouTube views, with solid increases in average views for the vast majority of the rounds compared to last year. So it's all very fair to say, after a rocky few years, with a reduced team pool and more competitive sides, Super Rugby is on the up. But switching hemispheres and moving to the URC, which actually started a lot stronger post-COVID times, especially in TV viewership, had it managed to keep its momentum in terms of both competitiveness and interest from fans? Well, short answer, yes. With Ireland and South Africa's continued success throughout international rugby, the games have definitely been a lot closer, with lower average winning margins than the Super Rugby, especially from 2022 to 2024. Comparing the two competitions in the latest seasons does make things a bit closer. However, the numbers aren't always going to be fully accurate as well, with factors like Super Rugby's golden point system nullifying draws for the most part, whereas 4 URC games ended in draws throughout the 2024-2025 season. In terms of fan interest, while the Super Rugby is better at dispersing fans amongst its 11 teams, with fairly similar attendance numbers and an average of about 14,000 a game, in the URC, derbies reign supreme. In a record-breaking game, Leinster and Munster would bring 80,000 into Croke Park in Ireland, beating out any crowd records we'd ever seen in Super Rugby. Across the board, the URC would see a 14% increase in attendance from the previous season, on par or a slightly higher percentage than the Super Rugby. And while a few non-derby games, like the Lions vs Ospreys for example, had Ellis Park looking like this, instances were few and far between, with positive growth resulting in an average attendance of around 12,000. Even the URC YouTube channel has seen great numbers, with 3 of their highlight packages from the previous finals which we've just seen, in their top 10 most viewed ever videos on the URC, formerly Pro 14 or Pro 12 YouTube channel. So while the URC did see higher increases for crowd numbers, the surge wasn't quite the same at TV audience level, at only around a 2 to 3% increase. Clearly broadcasters are still happy though, with 5-year deals being dished out from the likes of Sky Sports and Premier Sports. So with so much growth between both competitions right now, Is there really any reason for South African teams to come back to the Super Rugby? Well, in my opinion, not really. The two recent big names who have been calling for the change have been Michael Hooper and Frans Steyn. While Hooper's reasoning more comes down to player welfare,
I hear that it's very difficult for South Africa to play in that URC. It's tough going for them physically to play up and down there, and I don't think that the sentiment around it isn't like this URC thing's the best thing ever.
I think the fact he wasn't actually a South African rugby player at the time, who I mentioned were definitely getting the shorter end of the stick in Super Rugby, definitely has a factor, as I think he's looking at it maybe with some rose-tinted glasses on. However, the actual South African former rugby player calling for this change had different motives. Frans Steyn is the Cheetahs director, and since being kicked from the URC, the Cheetahs, and possibly the Southern Kings, who we talked about earlier, are eyeing up the Super Rugby for South African teams to possibly join back into the competition once more.